Okay, so we'll pick up where we were a second ago, and we have this definition, which just moves both of these circles in space, and we can see we can animate them. What we don't have a great sense of is what that curve, what that trace of this endpoint actually looks like. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to duplicate all of this, because this is giving us the animation. We're going to duplicate all of it so that we're going to feed it a number of values instead of giving it just the one value of the angle rotation. And so what I want to do, again, is to just copy everything but my sliders. And so if you need to, you can adjust things a little bit, pull things over so that they're not in the way, or they don't get selected by other things. Let's select this whole thing. We'll do Control-C, Control-V. We're just going to drag this down to the bottom, because we know we've got now this duplication. So maybe I'll just get them a little closer together so it's clear what's where. So what we want to do is we want to capture this endpoint. Right now we just have one endpoint. And this is going to be, what we're going to do now is going to probably cause some of you a little bit of concern, and I'd say just hang in with me, and these things will start to make more sense as we play with them more. But what we want to do is anything in this second group that we're feeding the angle to, we want to replace with something else. And so we can see rotation angle, what's coming down here, it's being fed to that multiplier. We can just double check that. That's coming up to rotation angle. So let's do one thing down here just on the side over to the left, is that what we want to do is to feed not everything that happens right now when we send that slider from 0 to 360, is that every time we move it, it's giving one value out. We slide it to 180, the value is 180. We slide it to 360, it's 360. What we want to do now is actually give a range of values, or give multiple values. If other people have done any programming, this is Grasshopper's way of dealing with a loop, because what you would do with a loop is you would say, okay, go incrementally from 0 to 360. Every time that changes, change something else. The way that Grasshopper does it is that it captures all of that data in a list. And what we'll do here is we're going to give it a range. And so range is under sets, and we're going to deal a lot with these later. We're going to deal with lists, and we're going to deal with sequence. For now, we're going to create a range. And that range is going to be between 0 and 360. And range requires two things. It requires a domain, which is the minimum and the max, and how many steps in between. And so let's first construct a domain. So if we type construct domain is the third one down. The default for a domain is 0 to 1. And this is really helpful later when we want to create a range between kind of open and closed, off and on, those types of things. For now, we'll leave A set to 0, and we'll right-click B. Here, maybe I'll do it the other way that I was doing it before. Let's make a number container. We'll feed that in. We'll right-click. We'll set this number to be 360. So then once I have that, I can also right-click and change NUM to 360. So I know that that's 360. Let me do another thing. I'm going to make a panel. Panels are really useful, so you can see what is coming out of a component. So if we plug this in, we can see it's a range from 0 to 360. When I plug, let's see, we'll plug that domain into the range. The default in the range is 10 steps. So we can see if we plug this into the panel and and we expand this, we have 10 numbers, which is from a range of 0 to 360. And so what happens is that when we give this range to one of our components, it's going to give it all 10 of those numbers. And what I'd also like to do is maybe just give a, let's see, a slider. Let's go from 10 to 100. And we can see what happens if I expand the panel. It's going to add more numbers. But what's nice is that it always goes from 0 to 360. And this is what a range does. And so I can increase this. We can have 100 steps between 0 and 360. So I'm going to turn this down for a second and so we can start. I'll delete that panel. And so now what I want to do is plug that domain into something else that we had a second ago. So let's see, where did we have rotation coming from? So here's the rotation angle. We'll trace some of these down. Where's the first one that it comes to? Is the A times B. And so let's see what was coming in. A. One value. So that was the multiplier. So A is the 179, which is the angle that we're set at. Let's plug in our range. Now we can see what happens is that it's not one value that's given to it, it's a whole bunch of values. And so let's trace back through. Let's see where else we're giving our rotation angle to in the lower section. It's also coming into here. So we'll plug that in. And then I think there's one more, let's see, maybe not, rotation angle. So there's only 2 that are coming out, and they go to those 2. So these 2 are all set now. We can see if we increase the number of steps, we get more of these. And this is okay, don't be too worried about this. We're going to hide it in a second, because what we really want to do is we want to just interpolate all of those endpoints into one curve. And there's a Grasshopper component for that called interpolate, which is to create an interpolated curve through a set of points. All we need to give to this are the points. We can hide the points. Let's leave those points alone, but we can hide all of the other elements in the lower definition. We can also window these and middle mouse and hide them. And that should be everything that's there. So now let's see what happens. Let's see if this works. Looks a little off. So here's the rotation angle. Start at the beginning. We can see it's tracing through them, but it's off a little bit. And the reason why it's off a little bit is because it's interpolating these curves. And so what we can do is increase our number of steps. And we can see that that curve now gets a little more detail to it because of those extra points. And let's even just turn off those points and see how this looks. I'll go back to that rotation angle. And remember, we're going from 0 to 720 above. So now we're outside of that range. So we could change our range down below to not be from 360. Right click on this. Change this number from 360 to 720. And better yet, I don't know why we're doing, no, it does need to be duplicate, and we'll set this to be 720. I was going to pull it from the slider, but we'd have to do an extra step. So we'll set this to be 720. We'll relabel this to be 720. And it still has 100 steps. Maybe we want to increase this to 200. Didn't change really what that looks like. Now let's come back and cycle through these. So the rotation angle. Okay, we'll start at 0. Looks to be more or less following that curve. So that looks good. So now we have the best of both worlds. We have the representation at the bottom of that curve, the result of that, and at the top we have an animation of that. So we can kind of see, we can test against what we're seeing whether or not that looks right. So there's a couple more things that we could do. One is just to change the representation of some of these things and to play with it a bit. So I want to show you a couple of simple steps to do that. First is under Display and Preview, and we're going to do a custom preview. And this is the way that we can change the colors for some of the things that we see. What this needs is geometry and a color swatch. So type swatch. We can get that. I'm going to change it from white to black. Plug that in. And now we can see that that line is now black. I can hide my interpolate curve. And this gets the kind of frayed edge. This is the end. We can't do anything with that preview. We could still play with the interpolate curves, but we're getting a representation of these. So let's do the same thing above. And again, I can just copy, Control C and Control V. And come up above. I'm going to change this color. To a lighter color. And let's see, I want the point. And so right now the only thing that's represented in pink is the point, but anything else that's on above, I'm going to grab and pull in and hold down Shift as I do. You can see a little plus, which will add it. And so now we can have multiple inputs into here. We want, let's see, we got that line. We don't need this line. We can take our two endpoints, hold down Shift, hold down Shift again. We can get our rotated lines, this rotated line, holding down Shift, and keep adding them. We can hide these elements because now the representation is set. And we just have, let's see, the circle and the 2 points. So simplest way, it's not so simple, is to just find each one of these, hold down Shift, plug it in, is to just add them into their circle. You can tell we've got lines going everywhere, or wires going everywhere. Okay, so I'll hide everything that's up above. The 2 points are still here in Rhino, so I can grab those guys and I can move them around. We can see the interpolate curve is changing in relationship to these. And let's do one more thing, and that is, well, let's look at how This is working. That looks good. And if we just want to add a little bit more thickness to our lines, the simplest way to do this in the kind of drawing mode is that we can create what's called a pipe. And so a pipe will take any curve and turn it into a cylinder and give it thickness. And so we can see what happens. We'll give this the curve. You can see it gets really thick. We can then give the pipe to here. And so it should turn black once we hide that. But we can also change the radius of this. And the radius, I think, default is 1. We can change this to 0.3. What I actually like doing is if I hit enter, it will revise that. Maybe I can go a little smaller. 0.25, enter. Your values will be different depending on what you used for your parameters. But now we get a slightly thicker black line. So let's just look at that rotation again. And cycle through that. And that looks good. So what I'll do is I'll stop here for your assignment. What I'm asking you to do is to now modify some of these. So move the locations of the circles, change the size of the circles, change the lengths of the outrigger, and see through manipulating those parameters, see what you can get for the curve that gets produced through this set of operations. Really what we're looking at starting to do is building your confidence for how you put together a number of these components, right? Think about any design or construction project, the way that we can start to communicate either to, say, a contractor or to digital fabrication equipment or a robot is through that set of instructions. And so what we have here is both resulting geometry on the right-hand side and your intent and your procedure, the kind of recipe, the script to build that geometry that's on the right is now embedded on the left. And we have the association between the two. And so we can move back and forth between them. So I know that I moved quickly. Now I think what you can do is to play with some of these components, change something, break it. Save your file now before you start trying to break it, but you can always undo. You can always go back and see what you did. This is one of the best ways to learn, is now that you've got this, just start kind of stretching it, seeing what its boundaries are, what's the range of movement. And I think often you'll be surprised that when you were designing, working in a space like this, increase the size of the sliders, right? Maybe the range is even greater than you thought it was. So play with that. I'm gonna pause here and then I'll do a bonus section which will show you how to split the geometry of the black lines so that before we draw it, it's light gray, and after we draw it in terms of the animation, it ends up black. And so there's a nice relationship between that because we can see exactly where we're tracing. So we can pause here, take a break, and then we'll do one last step which will help you understand a little bit of working with lists.